My name is Daniel Marsh. I'm 51 years old, and 11 days ago, I buried my wife. If you're watching this, you probably already know how these stories go. Someone gets betrayed. Someone gets even. But before I tell you what happened at the funeral, before I tell you about the phone call that changed everything, I need you to understand who Diane was, because none of this makes sense without her. Diane and I were married for 22 years. She was the kind of woman who remembered the names of your coworkers' children. She sent birthday cards 2 days early so they'd never arrive late. She was the senior accountant at Harborline Freight, a mid-sized shipping and logistics company on the east side of the city, and she had worked there for 14 years, long enough that half the warehouse crew called her Mom, behind her back, and she pretended not to know. She was healthy. That's the part nobody could explain. No history of heart disease, no warning signs, nothing. On a Tuesday evening in early October, she came home from work quieter than usual. She said she had a headache. She went to bed early, and at 2:47 in the morning, I woke up because she wasn't breathing beside me anymore. The paramedics told it a massive cardiac event, likely triggered by acute stress. Acute stress. I remember staring at that phrase on the report for a long time, because in 22 years, I had never known Diane to be a woman who let stress get anywhere near her heart. She was the calm one. She was the one who talked me down, not the other way around. I didn't know, not yet, that 4 days before she died, she had sat alone in her car in the Harborline parking lot for 40 minutes after her shift, staring at her phone, before she came home and told me she had a headache. I didn't know about the folder. I didn't know about my brother. Let me tell you a little more about her, because I think it matters. I think it's the only way any of what comes next will actually land the way it should. We met at 29, both of us a little bruised from things that hadn't worked out before, both of us cautious in the particular way people are when they've learned that love can cost you something. She worked reception at the accounting firm where I'd gone to get my taxes done, badly, for the 3rd year in a row, and she caught the mistake on my return before anyone else did, walked it over to my desk herself, and said, very plainly, "You're going to owe the IRS a letter of explanation if you file it like this. Let me fix it." I married that directness 18 months later. I married a woman who noticed things other people missed and who fixed them quietly without asking for credit. She was the one who noticed Caleb's stutter before the pediatrician did and found him a specialist 2 towns over who worked wonders by the time he was 7. She was the one who noticed, 3 years into my job at the grocery chain, that a supplier was quietly overbilling us on produce shipments. She'd glanced at an invoice I left on the kitchen table one night, purely out of habit, and said, "Daniel, has anyone actually checked this math?" Nobody had. It saved my department $11,000 a year for the next 4 years, and nobody at my company ever knew whose kitchen table that catch had happened on. She did this, quietly, constantly. It was who she was, down to the studs. She noticed what other people were too busy, too trusting, or too tired to see, and then she fixed it, without fanfare, without meeting anyone to know it was her. Which is exactly why, when she found something in those Harborline records that she couldn't quietly fix on her own, it should have terrified me more than it did. Diane didn't bring problems home unless she had already tried everything else first. If she was carrying something heavy enough that it showed on her face, it meant she had already run out of quiet ways to solve it. I just didn't know that yet, standing in that reception hall with a cup of cold coffee in my hand. The funeral was on a Saturday. Gray sky, that thin, cold rain that doesn't quite commit to being real rain. Diane's mother was there, frail and silent in the front row. Our son, Caleb, 20 years old, stood beside me the entire day like a soldier standing guard, jaw tight, refusing to let himself cry in front of people until we got home. My brother Richard was there too, in a black suit that cost more than my monthly mortgage, shaking hands, hugging people, playing the role of grieving brother-in-law so convincingly that if I hadn't known what I would learn 3 hours later, I might have believed it myself. That's the thing about people like Richard. They don't look like what they are. They look like family. After the burial, everyone gathered at the funeral home's reception hall for the kind of quiet, terrible small talk that happens after you put someone in the ground. Little sandwiches nobody wants to eat. Coffee going cold in styrofoam cups. People telling you she's in a better place, as if that's supposed to help. I was standing near the back window, alone for the first time all day, when a man I recognized but couldn't immediately place walked up to me. "Daniel," he said quietly, "I'm David Reyes. I was Diane's supervisor at Harborline." I shook his hand. I'd met David maybe twice before, at a company holiday party years back. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, the kind of steady, unremarkable man who runs operations departments for 30 years and retires with a good pension, and nobody's ever afraid of him. He looked afraid now. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said, and then he glanced over his shoulder, toward the crowd, toward, I would realize later, toward Richard, who was 15 feet away, laughing softly at something someone had said. David's eyes came back to me, and his voice dropped almost to nothing. "Daniel, I need to talk to you. Not here. It's about Diane. It's about—" He stopped himself. His hand was trembling slightly around his coffee cup. "You need to see this. I want you to understand something about grief. On the day you bury your wife, your brain is not built for mysteries. I was exhausted in a way I didn't have language for. Part of me wanted to say, 'Not today. Whatever it is, it can wait.' But there was something in David Reyes's face, a specific kind of fear, the kind that isn't about you, the kind that's about them, that made the hair rise on the back of my neck." "See what?" I asked. He shook his head, almost imperceptibly, and glanced again toward Richard. "Not here," he whispered. "Call me tonight, please. It's important, Daniel. It's about why she—" His voice cracked, and he didn't finish the sentence. He just squeezed my arm once, said "I'm so sorry," loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, and walked away. I stood there holding a cup of cold coffee, watching my wife's boss disappear into the crowd, and for the first time all day, grief was joined by something else: suspicion. To understand what happened next, you need to know about my brother. Richard is 4 years older than me. Our father, Walter Marsh, built a small trucking and freight brokerage company from nothing. 1 truck, then 3, then a fleet of 12, then a contract network across 2 states. He built it over 35 years, and when he got sick, he told both of us the same thing, more than once, sitting at the kitchen table: "This company is for both of you boys. Whatever happens to me, you split it, 50-50. You take care of each other." Dad died 6 years ago. Richard, as the older brother and the one who'd worked in the business longer, took over day-to-day operations. I trusted him. I had my own career. I managed logistics for a regional grocery chain, and I told Richard I didn't need to be hands-on, that I trusted him to run things fairly, and just wanted my half honored the way Dad intended. For 6 years, I believed that's what was happening. What I didn't know What Diane apparently found out was that 3 years ago, Richard had quietly restructured the company's ownership documents. He'd used a period when I was consumed with Caleb's medical scare. My son had a serious surgery that year, and I was barely functioning. Showing up to work on autopilot, to have paperwork filed that diluted my ownership stake from 50% down to something closer to 8%, dressed up in language about operational shares versus founding shares. That sounded technical enough that, had I ever actually read it carefully, I might have signed off on it without understanding what it meant. I did sign something that year. I remember it vaguely. Richard bringing over a stack of routine restructuring documents for the accountant, telling me it was boring paperwork about tax classifications, needing my signature because I was still a listed co-owner. I was sitting in a hospital cafeteria the week before Caleb's surgery when I signed it. I trusted my brother completely. I didn't read every line. That was the day my inheritance quietly disappeared. And here's where Diane comes in. Harborline Freight, Diane's employer, was one of the trucking company's major subcontracting partners. Richard's company, Marsh Freight Solutions, routed a huge volume of shipments through Harborline's warehouses, which meant Richard's invoices, contracts, and financial statements passed, indirectly, across systems that intersected with Diane's department more than either of them probably ever expected. About 5 weeks before she died, Diane was reconciling a batch of intercompany invoices for a routine quarterly audit. Something didn't add up. A pattern of invoices from Marsh Freight Solutions that were billed at inflated rates, paid out, and then partially routed back through a secondary account, an account registered to a company called WPM Logistics Consulting. WPM, Walter P. Marsh, our father's initials. Richard had created a shell company using our dead father's initials to quietly skim money off every shipment his own company processed, money that, under the ownership structure Dad had actually intended, should have been split between both of his sons. Diane recognized the initials immediately. She knew our father's name, she knew Richard, and being the meticulous, quietly relentless woman she was, she didn't say a word to anyone at work. She started pulling records, quietly, building a file. She never told me any of this. I've asked myself so many times why. I think I know the answer now. She wanted to be completely certain before she brought something this devastating into our home. She wanted proof, not suspicion, because she knew what it would do to me and to the relationship between me and the only brother I had left. She was still building that proof when she died. I didn't sleep the night of the funeral. I sat in Diane's home office, a small converted spare bedroom, with her desk, her plants, her handwriting still on a sticky note stuck to the monitor that said, "Call Nom Sunday." At 9:40 p.m., I called David Reyes. He picked up on the first ring, like he'd been sitting by the phone. "Daniel," he said, "thank you for calling. I wasn't sure you would. You said it was about Diane, about why she—" I stopped, the way he had stopped that afternoon. "David, what is this about?" There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, could hear him deciding something. 4 days before she passed, he said slowly, "Diane came to my office. She was pale. Shaking, actually. I'd never seen her like that. She locked the door. She told me she'd found something in the audit records that she thought was serious. Financial fraud, involving a vendor company. She wouldn't tell me the name at first. She said she needed a few more days to be sure, because, her words, it involves family, and I need to be completely white before I say anything, because it's going to break something that can't be fixed." My hands were cold. She asked me. David continued, if the company had a secure way to store sensitive files outside the normal shared drives, somewhere with an audit trail, somewhere that couldn't be quietly deleted by someone with admin access. I set her up with a private access logged folder. Only she and I had the login. And 2 days later, she came back and finished loading the folder. About 40 files, invoices, bank transfer records, screenshots of ownership documents, and, he hesitated again, an audio recording, Daniel. My stomach dropped. I don't know exactly. I haven't listened to it. That felt like it should be your choice, not mine. But she labeled the folder herself before she left my office that day. She named it. He stopped, and I heard something in his voice break slightly. She named the folder, For Daniel, If Anything Happens to Me. I sat there in her office chair, staring at the sticky note on her monitor, and I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with rage. 2 days after she finished that folder, David said quietly, "She collapsed at home. I didn't put it together right away. I was in shock, like everyone else. But at the funeral today, I saw her brother-in-law standing there in that suit, shaking everyone's hand, and I remembered the way she looked when she locked my office door, and I couldn't just say nothing. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. I needed to be sure you were someone I could trust with this before I said anything, because whoever she was building this case against, Daniel, they need to not know this folder exists. Not yet. Send it to me," I said. My voice didn't even sound like mine. "Tonight. I already did. Check your email." The email arrived while we were still on the phone. David stayed on the line. I think he didn't want me to be alone when I opened it. And looking back, I'm grateful for that small kindness from a man who barely knew me. The folder contained 43 files. Bank statements showing WPM Logistics Consulting receiving quarterly transfers, each one timed within 48 hours of a Marsh Freight Solutions invoice payment from Harborline. Screenshots of the WPM Logistics business registration filed 18 months after our father died, registered to an address that, when I looked it up, turned out to be a UPS mailbox 3 towns over. Ownership restructuring documents for Marsh Freight Solutions, the same routine paperwork I'd signed in that hospital cafeteria, annotated by Diane in the margins with small red notes. 8.2%, compared to original 50-50 partnership agreement. See Exhibit C. She had even found the original partnership agreement, the one our father had drawn up with his lawyer decades earlier, scanned and filed as Exhibit C. My father's actual signature and intent preserved in ink, buried and forgotten in a box until my wife found it. And then there was the audio file. I almost didn't play it. Some part of me, the part still standing in a cemetery that morning, watching them lower her casket, wanted to protect whatever piece I had left. But I clicked it. It was 4 minutes and 12 seconds long. The recording quality was rough, clearly taken discreetly, maybe from a phone in a bag or a coat pocket. But the voices were unmistakable. Diane's voice, steady but tense. "I know about WPM, Richard. I know it's yours. I have the transfer records." And then my brother's voice, a voice I'd known my entire life. A voice that used to read me stories when I was 6 years old and scared of the dark, colder than I had ever heard it. "You need to think very, very carefully about what you do with whatever you think you have. Because if you take this to Daniel, I promise you, I will make sure everyone at that company thinks you're the one who's been cooking the books. I have 3 years of access to those systems too, Diane. I can bury you. And Daniel already lost his father. You really want him to think his own wife was some kind of embezzler in her final months at that company. Think about your son. Think about what this does to this family. Walk away from it." There was a long silence on the recording. Then Diane's voice, quieter, but not broken, steady, almost defiant. "You threatened the wrong person, Richard. I'm not walking away. I'm just going to be very sure before I move." The recording ended. I sat there in the dark of her office for a long time, David still quiet on the phone, and I understood, finally and completely, what acute stress had actually meant on that autopsy report. My brother had looked my wife in the eyes and threatened to destroy her reputation, threatened our son's peace of mind, threatened everything she loved to protect money he'd stolen using our dead father's initials. She carried that threat alone for 4 days. She carried it home to me and called it a headache. "Daniel," David said softly into the silence, "are you still there?" "I'm here," I said. And for the first time since 2:47 a.m. 11 days earlier, my voice didn't shake. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I looked at the sticky note on her monitor. "Call Nam Sunday." Deanne, still taking care of everyone, even in her own handwriting, even now. "I'm going to finish what she started," I said, exactly the way she would have wanted it done, carefully, completely. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth about who she really was." Part 5. Building the Case. I didn't confront Richard the next day. I didn't confront him the next week. Diane had spent 5 weeks being careful, methodical, quiet, and I understood now that this was the only way to actually win against someone like my brother. Rage tips your hand. Patience wins. I took 2 weeks off work, telling everyone I needed time to grieve. Some of that was true. But most of those 2 weeks, I spent at Diane's desk, going through every file in that folder, line by line, cross-referencing bank statements, building a timeline so airtight that no lawyer, no accountant, no family court could pretend it was a misunderstanding. I hired a forensic accountant, a quiet, no-nonsense woman named Priya Anand, who specialized in exactly this kind of family business fraud. I didn't tell her the full family story at first. I just handed her the files and asked her to verify them independently, without any of my own bias shaping what she found. 3 days later, she called me into her office. "Mr. Marsh," she said, sliding a folder across the table, a folder with her own findings, corroborating every single document Diane had already gathered, plus more. "Your brother has been running this scheme for approximately 3 years. Total diverted funds conservatively are just under $940,000. That's before interest, before any legal penalties. And this," she tapped the restructuring document I'd signed in that hospital cafeteria, "this is not a minor paperwork error. Under the language here, and cross-referenced against your father's original partnership agreement, which very clearly states an irrevocable 50-50 structure, barring written consent from both parties with independent legal counsel present, which you did not have, this restructuring is legally void. You were never actually reduced to 8%, Mr. Marsh. Not legally. You've owned 50% of that company this entire time. Your brother has simply been telling you, and everyone else, a lie." I sat in that office and felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet. Not just anger, not just grief, but a strange, sharp clarity. Diane hadn't just uncovered theft. She had uncovered the exact legal thread that would unravel everything Richard had built on top of his lie. I asked Priya one more question before I left that day. "If I take this to a lawyer and file this properly, quietly, without tipping him off, how long before I can be standing in a room with my brother and every piece of proof in front of him, in a way he can't talk his way out of?" She looked at me for a long moment. "About 3 weeks," she said, "if you're patient." "I've had a lot of practice being patient," I said, "in the last 2 weeks." Those 2 weeks were the hardest of my life, harder in some ways than the funeral itself, because grief at least lets you fall apart in public. This required the opposite. Every family dinner, every phone call with my mother, Every time Richard texted me a casual "thinking of you, let me know if you need anything," I had to sit with the truth sitting like a stone in my chest and say nothing. I had to hug my brother at Caleb's fall semester check-in dinner, knowing what I knew, and smile. Caleb noticed something was different about me before I told him anything. He's sharp, my son. He gets that from his mother. One night, about 10 days after the funeral, he found me at Diane's desk at 1 a.m., surrounded by printed bank statements, and he didn't ask what I was doing. He just pulled up a chair, sat down next to me, and started reading. I hadn't planned on telling him yet. I wanted to protect him a little longer, the way you want to protect your kids even after they're grown enough that the protecting isn't really yours to give anymore. But he read 3 pages of the WPM logistics transfer records, looked up at me, and said, very quietly, "This is Uncle Richard, isn't it?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. "Does he know Mom found this?" Caleb asked. "He knows she found something," I said. "I don't think he knows how much." Caleb sat with that for a long moment, staring at the desk, at his mother's handwriting in the margins of the exhibits. Then he said something I'll never forget. "She was building a case, Dad. Right up until the end. She wasn't scared of him. She was just being careful, the way she was careful about everything." He looked at me. "Don't rush this. Do it exactly the way she would have, all the way through." That became something like our shared mantra for the rest of those 3 weeks, the way she would have done it. Every time I wanted to call Richard and scream at him, every time the grief curdled into something hot and reckless in my chest, I thought about that folder, about the careful red pen notes in the margins, about a woman who had every reason to be terrified and instead chose to be thorough. Priya Anand's forensic report took 9 days to finalize properly. She wanted every figure independently verified against Harborline's own audited records, cross-checked against Marsh Freight Solutions' filed tax documents, cross-checked again against the shell company's banking history, which she obtained legally through a subpoena Gerald helped draft under the pretense of a routine business dispute, careful not to tip Richard off that anything larger was coming. Gerald, for his part, spent those same 9 days quietly, confirming that our father's original 1998 partnership agreement had never been formally amended by both parties with independent counsel, the single detail that meant everything Richard had built over 3 years could collapse the moment it was placed in front of a judge, or, as it turned out, in front of our mother's dining room table. By the time the meeting actually happened, I wasn't walking in with suspicion. I was walking in with certainty, built the exact way Diane had always built everything, slowly, quietly, and completely. Part 6. The Meeting. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, I called Richard and told him our mother wanted the whole family together to go through some of Dad's old paperwork, old insurance documents, a few boxes she wanted to finally clear out of her garage. It was a believable lie, because it was almost true. Our mother genuinely had boxes she wanted to sort, and she genuinely had no idea what I'd actually arranged. I told her, privately, the real reason. She cried for a long time. Then she looked at me with a steel in her eyes I hadn't seen since my father's funeral and said, "Your father would want you to do this exactly the way you're doing it. Carefully. Completely." We met at the old family house, Mom's house, on a Sunday afternoon. Richard arrived in his usual easy, confident way, kissing Mom on the cheek, clapping me on the shoulder, asking Caleb how college was going, playing the role he'd always played. In the dining room, waiting quietly, sat Priya Anand with her files, and my attorney, a sharp, unshowy man named Gerald Whitfield, who had spent 30 years handling exactly these kinds of disputes. Richard's face changed the moment he saw them. "What is this?" he said, his easy tone cracking slightly at the edges. "Sit down, Richard," I said. He didn't sit. "Daniel, whatever this is, sit down," he said. I didn't raise my voice for the next 40 minutes. I didn't need to. Priya walked him, methodically, through the WPM logistics transfer records, through the shell company registration, through the inflated invoices, through the original partnership agreement our father had signed with his own attorney decades ago, promising a 50-50 split that could never legally be altered without both of us present with independent counsel. I watched my brother's face go through every stage, dismissive, defensive, cornered, and finally something close to panic, as he understood that every single piece was documented, verified, time-stamped, and duplicated in 3 separate secure locations. And then I played the audio recording. The room went completely silent. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Caleb, sitting beside me, went rigid, his jaw locked exactly the way it had at the funeral. And Richard sat frozen, staring at the table as his own voice filled the room. "I can bury you. Think about what this does to this family. Walk away from it." When the recording ended, nobody spoke for a long time. "That was 5 days before Diane died," I finally said. "You looked my wife in the eyes and threatened to destroy her, to hurt our son, to protect money you stole from your own dead father's name." She carried that alone for 4 days. She came home and told me she had a headache, Richard. And 2 days later, she was gone. "Daniel, I didn't mean for..." His voice cracked. For the first time in my life, I watched my brother look genuinely, completely afraid. "I'm not accusing you of killing her," I said, and it was the truth. The autopsy made clear it was a cardiac event, not violence, nothing a court could call murder. "But you put a threat on her heart that she was never built to carry, and I will spend the rest of my life believing that threat is what broke something in her that never should have broken. That's not a legal fact. That's a fact I have to live with. But this," I slid Priya's report and Gerald's legal filing across the table toward him, "this is a legal fact. You're going to sign over full, correct ownership, effective retroactively, the way Dad actually structured it. You're going to repay every cent of the $940,000 on a schedule Gerald will draft, or he files criminal fraud charges by Monday morning and I let a courtroom, not a dining room, decide what happens to you." Richard looked at our mother. She didn't say a word. She just looked back at him with an expression I will never forget, not rage, but a kind of devastated, quiet disappointment that was somehow so much worse. He signed everything that afternoon. Before he left, he stopped at the front door, his hand on the frame, and turned back to look at me. For a moment I saw something in his face that almost looked like the brother I remembered, the one who used to carry me on his shoulders through the cornfield behind Dad's first warehouse, the one who taught me to drive stick shift in the church parking lot when I was 15 and he was 19 and neither of us had told our parents. "I never wanted it to go this far," he said quietly. "I told myself I'd pay it back eventually. I told myself it wasn't really stealing if I was going to put it back before anyone noticed." "You threatened my wife, Richard," I said. "There's no version of eventually that undoes that." He didn't have an answer for that. He nodded once, like a man accepting a verdict he already knew was coming, and walked out to his car. I watched him from the window until his taillights disappeared down Mom's Street, and I felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, something in my chest finally unclench. My mother came and stood beside me at the window. She hadn't said a single word during the entire 40 minutes, and I'd been half afraid of what she might say once everyone else had gone. Your father used to say Richard was the charming one, and you were the steady one, she said softly. I think he was wrong about which one of you actually turned out to be strong. She squeezed my hand. Diane would be proud of how you did this, Daniel. Carefully, without becoming him. That was the moment I finally let myself cry. Not at the cemetery, not at the reception hall, not even the night I listened to that recording alone in her office. It was standing at my mother's front window, watching my brother's car disappear, that I finally broke, and my mother held onto my arm the way she used to when I was small, and let me. I wish I could tell you the story ends there, with a clean, satisfying signature on a piece of paper. Real life is messier than that. Richard didn't go to prison. Under the settlement Gerald negotiated, he avoided criminal charges in exchange for full restitution, a legally binding repayment schedule, and permanently stepping down from any operational role in Marsh Freight Solutions, which, under the corrected ownership structure, became mine to run, exactly the way my father had always intended it to be split. Before it became fully mine, when Richard's shares were legally forfeited under the terms of the fraud settlement. He and I don't speak much now. I see him at holidays, for our mother's sake, and it's polite, and it's hollow, and some days I grieve that too. A second loss, quieter than the first, the loss of the brother I thought I had for 47 years. But here's what I actually want you to understand, if you've made it this far. I renamed the company 6 months later. It's no longer Marsh Freight Solutions. It's now called Diane Marsh Logistics Group. I petitioned to have her name legally attached to the business. Her quiet, relentless honesty had ultimately saved. Every driver, every warehouse worker, every accountant who works there now knows her name, knows a small piece of her story, because I made sure the plaque in the front lobby tells it plainly. Founded on integrity, named for the woman who refused to let it die. David Reyes still calls me every few months, just to check in. Caleb finished college and works with me now. He says he wants to run the company one day the way his mother would have wanted it run. Carefully, completely, with the books always clean. And every Sunday, I still find myself glancing at that sticky note on the office monitor. Call Mom Sunday. Because some habits, some small proofs of who a person was, deserve to stay exactly where they were left. They buried my wife on a gray Saturday in October. But 11 days later, on a phone call I almost didn't answer, I learned that the quietest, gentlest person I ever knew had also been the bravest. That in her final weeks, facing a threat meant to silence her, she chose truth over safety. And left behind exactly what she needed to make sure that truth would outlive her. If you're going through something like this, if someone in your life has ever tried to make you believe that silence is safer than the truth, I hope Diane's story tells you what it took me far too long to understand. The people who threaten you to keep a secret are almost always the ones with the most to lose when it comes out. Don't let them win. She didn't. And in the end, neither did I. This has been a dramatized story shared for entertainment purposes. All names have been changed. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Silken Vengeance for more true inspired stories of quiet justice.